Hello, you're watching James. My name's James, you're watching me, and I am talking about watches. Well, it's time for another full in-depth review, and it's time for another full in-depth review of a Seiko. This particular one is the 60 style. I'll stick the reference number up there. No point in me trying to remember that one. This is a watch that really stood out to me when I saw it. I thought, wow, check that out. What a different looking watch, what an interesting looking watch, and what a dial of a watch that has a lot going on, but it all seems to work in a nice cohesive sort of manner. And it has turned out to be exactly that for me. A really interesting watch, and a watch that I've been really enjoying wearing. But of course, being a Seiko, there is a few little things that sort of make me a little bit second guess it, or perhaps be a little bit disappointed, or at least wish had been done a little bit better. But absolutely, Seiko, we kind of tend to understand that now, so we keep that in mind when we are buying it. And today in the full review, I'm obviously going to point out those things, so if you are thinking about buying this one, at least you'll know what you're getting into. Now, if you are interested in buying this one after watching this review, and hey, it's a great looking watch, and it's a Seiko, it's really good, so you might actually want to buy it, well, please be careful of how much money you spend on it. Because like a lot of Seikos, especially what I've noticed from the Presage line, is that the prices vary from site to site. And you obviously want to get this watch at the best price possible, because the best price possible that I've seen here within Australia on an Australian website is 795 Australian dollars. And that is not a cheap amount of money. When you look at this watch, when you put all the factors together, you may consider that to be a little bit too expensive. But if you particularly like it, well, that's probably one of the cheapest prices you are going to be able to find for it. But as we know, obviously with watches, a lot of people buy watches, sell watches, so it might even be one that's worthwhile keeping a sort of lookout on the second-hand market. But guys, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, before we jump into the full review, do you mind just tapping on that subscribe button? It does make a big difference to me and this channel. But let's flip the camera around now and let's check out this Seiko Presage 60 style. So here we have another Seiko on the channel. Yes, I do like Seiko. I've owned lots of them and I've featured lots of them. But this one, there's something a little bit special about it, something a little bit different. And I really did like that sort of difference in looks. This one here is the Seiko Presage SSA449J, also known as the 60 style. The box is pretty much what we expect from Seiko. It is perfectly fine. It's actually quite a nice inner and outer box, nice and white, like they do like their white boxes. And of course inside, a nice large cushion with our watch presented to us. Now, before we talk about anything, you're going to see the watch is stopped. That is for a deliberate reason, because I want to show you this sort of power reserve indicator. You'll see there that there is a third hand. It is sort of like a cream color, almost looks like a GMT hand, but it's not a GMT hand. It is actually the power reserve hand. And you'll see built into the sort of outer chapter ring, or sort of the around the indices there's a line that goes from here all the way around to here. That is your power reserve indicator. It says empty up here, gives you a percentage, and down to full. I do particularly like this version of a power reserve indicator. I think on a lot of watches that I've seen with reserve indicators, they can be a little bit sort of stuck in the corner there, or pushed in there, or squished in. This sort of seems to sort of complement the watch. In fact, it even makes another feature to it that I actually particularly like. The hand just looks cool, and I like how it's sort of added into there in that sort of outer, almost in the minute track there. But let me show you it in action, just in case you haven't seen one of these. You'll see that we actually have the crown here, not screw down. It's a sort of a dress style watch, being a Presage, so no screw down crown. But as we wind it up, you'll start to see that power indicator hand move, and then obviously the second hand now starts. And it's actually a really functional feature to have, is that power reserve. It really shows you how much power you have left in your watch, so you know if you're going to have to wind it a little bit, or if you don't need to worry about it, all the way up to full. All right, let's stick this to 10 o'clock and let's actually start talking about the rest of the watch. So now I've reset it to our favorite 10 o'clock position. You can see the power reserve indicator is still at full. Second is ticking. Let's talk about the rest of this watch, because there's a lot going on here. And normally when I say there's a lot going on, generally that can be a bit of a negative. For this watch, however, it's a real positive. There's so much going on here, but it all works together so well. And that's actually what I really like about this. The dial is like a matte black, and there's a lot of things printed on here. You'll see that outer second track, minute track, hour track, obviously that power indicator track there. Inside here, we've got little dots of lume just on the inside of those applied indices. Seiko is an applied silver sort of brushed logo, but Presage and automatic underneath are printed on there. That's all printed in like a creamy, almost slightly off yellow color, and that sort of fits in really well with the lume that's then on those hands. Not a huge amount of lume on this one. The hands and those tiny little dots on the insides of those indices are lumed. While we're talking about it, I'll throw it up now, just a quick bit of footage of it. Nothing too much to really stand out here. This is in the Presage line, and we've got to keep that into consideration because even though it may not look specifically like a dress watch, it is loomed like a dress watch. We then have our applied indices. They're all shiny there. You can see that they're all polished. They have a few facets to them. The 12 o'clock has 3 sort of facets. The rest have 2. Down here with what looks like a sub-second registry is not a sub-second registry. Obviously we can see the second hour ticking around. This is actually our date window, and it's a really interesting way of having the date. I've seen it a couple of times on watches, but it's not the normal, and I just think it gives another sort of interesting aspect to the watch. That subdial as well is also quite sunken down, which really then gives another sort of a 3D effect to this watch, which is quite cool. Now the hands, they do complement those polished indices as well because they are all polished. Nice and long minute hand, which is cool. Nice long polished second hand as well. That's not loomed at all, the second hand. That's just a nice polished stainless steel. But it has that sort of an interesting hybrid look for me. It sort of looks a little bit like a sort of retro diver, looks a little bit like a dress watch, looks a little bit like a sort of complicated watch. Just has an interesting overall look to it, and it comes with a really interesting set of dimensions as well, especially from a watch from the Presage lines, because when I look at it and even when I wear it, it does feel like a relatively smaller watch. Not a small watch, but a relatively small watch, but the dimensions don't say that at all, because the case diameter is 41.1 millimeters. The width, now this will shock you a little bit, is 14.9 millimeters, making this a very wide watch, but you don't really notice that when you are actually wearing it on wrist. It sort of feels and looks thick, or at least when you think about it as 14.9 millimeters, but it doesn't sit like that on wrist. Lug to lug, we're looking at 48.7 millimeters, which is a nice actually length. And you can see overall, it's a slightly larger watch for Seiko, even though it doesn't look like it in hand or on wrist. 20 millimeter lug width, and on this bracelet, which is supplied with it, is 136 grams. So probably slightly lighter than you expect when you then sort of look at those rest of those dimensions. That dial is covered by a piece of boxed hardlex, which does sort of add to that thickness, and it sort of adds to that sort of vintagey 60s divers look as well, which I think looks quite cool. No distortions at the edges or any at the extreme edges there, which is not too bad. So legibility on this one is actually quite good when you look at this hands versus the black background. The bezel on this one is fixed. You cannot move it, even though it looks like a bezel. No, you're not moving that one around at all. But I think it looks really good, and I like the sort of differences in finishing, because you have a stainless steel piece separating the hardlex with the bezel insert there. The bezel insert, I believe, is aluminium. It is black, it's like a matte black with some printing on it as well. And then there's an outer piece of stainless steel, which is polished, which really sort of finishes off the effect. So you end up with this polished, black, polished, then into the dial, which I quite like. And then that bezel then transitions down onto the lugs, which are brushed, and onto the case sides, which are polished. So you get a few different sort of textures on this one, which is nice. Obviously you've got an unguarded crown there with the Seiko S. Whilst we're looking there, you can see it has drilled end lugs, so we can make it easy to switch between sort of straps there if you don't want to wear it on this bracelet. And inside here we have the Seiko 4R57A movement, obviously having a sub date window there with a power reserve, but of course we also have hacking. In the second position, if you want to see that date move, because it is a slightly different date window there, you can just flick it and move it around. Isn't that cool? I could do that almost all day, I think. Let's set that up to number 1. That looks better now. Look at that. So yeah, hacking, hand winding, and obviously a quick set on that date there. And as always, I do like to see the movements on the Timegrapher. This is a slightly different movement, but I'm sort of expecting certain things from these Seiko movements. This 4R57 is going to be quite interesting. Let's check it on the Timegrapher and see how it is performing. Well, I am going to say that is probably not the best set of numbers that I've seen on my watches, but it's not horrendous. Beating at 21,600 vibrations per hour, 0.6 beat error, which is within sort of tolerances. It's an okay number, but not the best number. Amplitude's a little bit low, but it's okay. But minus 20 seconds a day, which is within the specifications of this particular movement. But normally you do tend to get a little bit better sort of seconds per day out of these Seiko movements. Okay, let's talk about this Seiko bracelet. And it's pretty much mostly what we expect on this sort of watches at this sort of price range. And that is that it's good, but it's not great. Let's talk about it because it's all brushed, a little bit of polishing on the sides, which again adds to that slightly interesting mix of characteristics of this watch. We do have solid end links there. It sort of fits into the case a little bit odd there though. You can see part of the case. I'm not sure if it's odd or it's good. I don't know. What do you think? Those solid end links do fit perfectly though, so they're really, really nice. Have split pins, not screws. We don't get screws on Seikos at this price, unfortunately. But this is where we come to probably one of the bigger negatives of this. Looking down, it's a small clasp, which I think suits the watch reasonably, and I actually don't mind a smaller clasp as long as I do get a good fit. But check that gap out. That is huge. That should not be allowed to leave the factory like that. And that is a choice as well. Somebody in Seiko has designed that. It has got through inspections. People have checked it off and said, yes, that's perfectly fine. Let's go with that clasp. And yeah, I'm not impressed by that. Realistically, you're not staring down at that angle of the clasp anyway, especially when it's sitting on your wrist. But that's quite disappointing, Seiko. That and only having 2 levels of micro adjust. I've got a good fit with this one. I do tend to be quite lucky with watches and fit. I do tend to get a good fit. But if you're sort of in between at all, you might struggle a little bit and have to wear this one a little bit tight or a little bit loose. It does get a little bit better when we go inside. It has a milled clasp. It sort of has that nice sort of chamfered edge or that sort of edge there which sort of tucks in. And when you look underneath then, it sort of fits on your wrist nicely. I've seen this on Seikos before and it is particularly nice. And then when we check out the back of the watch, we can see that 4R movement. And it does look particularly good actually. I like the look of this movement. Having that golden rotor for the Seiko on it is nice as well. Now this one comes with a screw down case back as you can see, but we've only got 50 meters of water resistance. Now on wrist, I actually really like this watch on wrist. I'm really enjoying it. But let's talk about the clasp a little bit. As you can see, you can still see that sort of weird step, but when you're looking down, you don't see it. And when you're wearing the watch, obviously you don't see it too much either. So it's not too much of a drama. And this is when you can start seeing on my 6 3/4 inch wrist that it is actually a slightly larger watch, especially for the Presage line within Seiko. It is a slightly larger version, but I think it looks really, really good. Sits down on wrist nicely, and it really sort of seems to hide that width as well. I would not have thought that this was a particularly wide watch or a thick watch. It wasn't until I actually measured it that I realized that, wow, it has a little bit of a chub to it. Certainly sits nice, feels nice, has a nice weight to it. It's only then when you're sort of looking down like that, when you start looking at that and you think, oh, why Seiko, why did you do that? So what do I like about this one? What don't I like about it? And what would I change? Well, I really like the look of this one. I like this really interesting mix of all these functions, all these sort of looks, this thin solid bezel, the date window down there, the power indicator. It all seems to work for me, and I really think it sort of ties together. Gives you some sort of vintage vibes, but without being a vintage watch. And I really like it. I like the overall size as well, and it's got a good movement, even though perhaps this one's not running as well as I would like. But there are some things that I probably don't like. Obviously, that clasp, I've mentioned that already. I don't really need to talk on and on about that more. That is definitely something that I don't like. The polished indices. I think that doesn't really work. I think having maybe a mixture between polished and brushing would have worked better. Just sort of dull them down just a tiny little bit. Same with the hands, maybe a little bit of brushing on there might have worked well, especially because of the overall style and looks of this one. But let's come back to this clasp again. Yeah, that's probably the main thing that really sort of disappoints me, especially when you're talking about a watch at this sort of price. And that's probably the next step that I'll be talking about in regards to dislikes. Although it's a great watch and I like it and I love Seiko, I'm not sure about the price value equation about this one. If I was looking at this watch at this sort of price and thinking about what else could I buy, well, I probably struggled to buy this one. I was lucky enough to get this one at a good price, so it was okay for me, and I do particularly like it, so I spent a little bit more money than probably what my sort of head would tell me to do. So what would I change? Well, yeah, those things. I'd bring the price down because that'd be fantastic. I'd bring the quality of that movement up, specifically to this particular model. Yeah, a bit of brushing on those indices and things, and give us a better clasp. Seiko, please do that at some point. But let's flip back to me now and give you some of my final thoughts about this Seiko Presage. So I bought this one because it really stood out to me, and it has continued to stand out to me since I have owned it. It has a really cool look to it. It has a slightly dressy, slightly everyday look, a slightly sort of retro diver look. It has a real sort of 60s theme to it, sort of that sort of skin diver, but with a few complications that are a little bit different. It's one of these Seikos that has really sort of changed my mind about what we can do on the dial of the watch. Because a lot of the watches that have this sort of things going on tends to be a little bit too complicated for me. It tends to look a little bit sort of out of whack. This one, it seems to pull it off really well. In fact, it's probably one of the better watches that I've ever seen or come across that is able to squish in all these things and still come away looking really cool. And I've really enjoyed owning it. I'm really enjoying wearing it. So it's probably going to be staying in my collection for a while. So guys, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. I do hope to see you in the next video.